Hello, my world history students, and welcome to the third part of the causes and start of World War I. These are notes 12.1c, and this is, of course, Mr. Marks. Another moment for you to look over the key points. If you remember, the war is going to be divided largely between two fronts. The Western Front is largely on the borders between Germany and France. Most of the Western Front is actually on French territory itself, which is one of the reasons the French are going to be so upset at the end of the war due to the damage done to their country. The Western Front has some of the bloodiest battles of the war. It is also a front that does not move much over the course of the war. It's a very static front. Long battles are going to be fought over very small areas of territory, as this will use trench warfare in an effort to keep the enemy from taking over the side that the other side is defending. This really slows down the war. It'll turn it into a stalemate, as we'll talk about later. On the other side of Germany is the Eastern Front. This was largely over the borders of Austria and Germany and their border with Russia. This also had fighting that was going on between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. The Eastern Front, while still very bloody, while still having a large amount of soldiers whose lives were lost, was not as did not use trench warfare for a variety of reasons, and so it was more of a war of mobility than the Western Front was. The Western Front will end up getting more, publicity, as it were, largely in the United States, because that's the part of the world that the U.S. will get involved in. But it's also where the war will eventually be decided due to some things that we'll talk about in the next presentation. There was a good deal of technology that changed just before World War I and would now change the way that warfare worked, but none of them were as important as the machine gun. The machine gun makes it so one person is now able to kill 50 to 100 people in about a minute. This new devastation, this ability to be able to aim and control an entire region with very few people changes the way that warfare has to work. And honestly, none of the armies were ready for it yet. They were still using very outmoded battle techniques that had been used since the time of Napoleon. These strategies just would not work with this new weapon that could hold an area with so few people. As you note here, there are machine guns at the time were still very bulky and required several people to use, as the person firing the gun had to have all of their concentration just on firing it. You had an ammo supplier, the person that was making sure that the ammo was being fed into the gun, and then you had spotters. In this particular squad, 3 of them, who would their job was first to point out targets, but secondly to defend the machine gun nest from anyone who would try to flank it. Another new technology being used during World War I is going to be the airplane. Airplanes are originally going to be used for reconnaissance purposes only, and while you'll see many movies and other sorts of things that will glorify the airplane pilots were often regarded as heroes during the war, the truth is the airplane had very little overall effect on the war. Like I said, the first thing that was used was for reconnaissance. Its job was to scout out where the enemy was. Information is one of the most important things for an army to have. If you know where the other army is and they don't know where you are, you have an extreme advantage. Airplanes, though, over the course of this war, will start to be outfitted with more and more weaponry. Bombs will start to be dropped from airplanes, as you can be more precise than just the firing of artillery shells. Airplanes will then be outfitted with machine guns. In this case, the guns will be put on a timing belt that will make it so they won't shred that airplane's own propeller as it shoots through it. this is what leads to the dog fights, the one-on-one air battles between these different pilots that would become so famous through the war. Next to the machine gun, probably the second most devastating new technology used during World War I would be the U-boat. These are German submarines, the U basically standing for underwater boat, the German word for underwater or undersea. These did tremendous damage to the Allied side. The Germans realized that Great Britain needed to be able to, because it's an island, it needed to be able to get materials and troops from Great Britain to the fronts in France, but also the U-boats would be able to take out supplies that were coming to Great Britain from its colonies or from other countries like the U.S. who were trying to supply it. The U-boats gave the Germans a pretty large advantage in the early parts of the war, and only once the British start to find ways of circumventing the U-boats does this advantage go away. In fact, it becomes a detriment, as we'll find out in the next few presentations, because these submarine tactics, especially as Germany becomes more desperate, are what will lead to the United States entering into the war. Thankfully, after World War I, many different nations would come to an agreement that poison gas should not be used. But during World War I, actually treaties had been made before World War I to disallow it, but this didn't stop the armies from using it. Probably the most famous being mustard gas, named such because of the mustard-colored cloud which went with it. These gases could paralyze the heart if breathed in. They could blister the skin, including the lining of the person's throat and their lungs. They could, do numerous just horrible things. And while by that self it's pretty devastating, they're also very unpredictable, because if the wind shifted in the wrong direction, the people that had used the poison gas could suddenly find themselves having to deal with it. Or even worse, nearby civilian towns might end up having a cloud of this gas going in and affecting the civilian population. All these military technologies, as well as the lack of innovation of tactics, led to a stalemate on the Western Front. This is a deadlock in which neither side is able to defeat the other. This is basically the two sides were too evenly set up, largely due to the type of warfare that was used at the time. And both sides were constantly hoping for some new advantage that would be able to break this stalemate, that would be able to make it so their troops would be able to move around these deep entrenchments that the other side had had. The reason for the stalemate was because World War I was a war of trench warfare. In order to avoid that machine gun fire and the artillery shells, which had become more powerful in their development, trenches were dug so that, as you can see on the right-hand picture, only small parts of the soldiers, like just the top of their heads, could be exposed to the enemy. They could use the sides of the trenches in order to avoid the damage from blasts and other sorts of shrapnel or weapons that would be fired at the time. The trenches by themselves were a hazard. I don't know if you've ever dug a hole in your yard, but it does not take long for that to fill up with water, especially if there's been any kind of rain. This was the case with these trenches. The bottom of these trenches were so muddy, so wet, that one of the real dangers was soldiers losing their feet as their feet kind of rotted out from them. If you've ever been in the bathtub for too long, you know how parts of your body get pruny because your cells have closed off due to the amount of water around them. Well, if you've ever been with wet shoes or having to walk in wet shoes for a while, you've probably noticed that the skin almost feels like it could start peeling off. This is what trench foot basically was. The funguses, other infections would find themselves into the smallest cut. An ingrown toenail would be enough for a person to lose their leg. On top of that, rats would infest these trenches. Diseases would run rampant through them. By themselves, not a pleasant place. Your feet would be soaking wet. If there weren't enough clouds, there's no other protection from the sun. So sunstroke or heat stroke would be very common during this time. And the only way to defeat your enemy would be to charge from your trench over to that other trench through an area called no man's land. Between this empty tract is going to be pocked with shell holes. Every tree, every house has been destroyed and just obliterated, and what's left of them are now obstacles for people to get through. There will be coils of barbed wire that the troops will put in place in order to try to defend their trenches. This man-made wasteland was the hardest part about it was that on the other side were men who had machine guns who would be able to rip apart any charge. Even if you made it all the way to your trench, quite often the enemy would just retreat to another trench that they had further back through another no man's land area that they had set up with landmines, other sorts of things. Mud pits were made in this place. I had mentioned that craters had been left due to the shelling from the artillery. There were hills and mountains in France that were now meters shorter due to how much of them had been blown off during this time. J.R.R. Tolkien, the famous writer of The Lord of the Rings, will be a person fighting for the British, and he will walk through no man's land after a battle had left and see that in these craters, which have now filled with water, as everything seemed to, the bodies that are just floating down there in the bottom, and that will be his inspiration for the Dead Marshes. All in all, this leads to that stalemate. No one would want to cross this, and even if you attempted to do so, the chances of you living through it were not all that good. This will lead us to the things which will have to break this stalemate and end the war in the next presentations.